He grabbed her wrist across the table hard enough that the silverware rattled. Not a nudge, not a tap, a grip, the kind that leaves a mark, the kind that says you are mine and you don't get to forget it, right there in the middle of a restaurant full of people cutting their steaks and laughing at their own jokes and noticing absolutely nothing. Gavin Mercer leaned forward, his jaw tight. His voice dropped to something that only Lena could hear, and he said, "You think about smiling at that waiter one more time. I will make tonight something you never forget." Lena Ashcroft stopped breathing. Not because she was afraid of the waiter. She hadn't even been looking at the waiter. She'd been looking at the door, calculating, the way she'd been calculating for the last 40 minutes, measuring the distance between her chair and the exit, wondering if she could make it look casual, wondering if casual was even possible when the man sitting across from her had already moved her purse to his side of the table without explanation and ordered her meal without asking. This was their first date. If you've ever sat across from someone and realized, not gradually, but all at once, like cold water, that you had made a terrible mistake, then you already know what Lena felt in that moment. You already know the specific calculus of it. How much can I do without making it worse? How loud is too loud? How quiet is too quiet? If you've been there, drop your city in the comments below. Let me know where you're watching from, because this story has already traveled further than I ever expected, and I want to know how far it's going to go. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. Hit that like button, because what happens next in this story is going to stay with you. Now, let's go back to that restaurant. Hot. Lena's name was not a name she'd chosen for drama. She was 27 years old, second year of law school, the kind of woman who kept a legal pad on her nightstand and color-coded her case briefs and had, until very recently, believed that being careful about everything was the same as being safe. She wasn't naive. She'd read the literature. She'd sat in a seminar on coercive control not 3 weeks before this dinner and taken 4 pages of notes and thought, with absolute sincerity, I would recognize that. I would never let that happen to me. She was currently letting it happen to her. Gavin had been introduced through a mutual study group. He was a financial analyst, or said he was, and he wore his confidence the way some men wear expensive cologne. Too much of it, everywhere, so you couldn't quite locate where it was coming from. He was handsome in a way that felt curated. The first time he asked her out, she'd said no. The second time, she'd said she was busy. The third time, he'd shown up outside her apartment building with coffee and a self-deprecating smile that she now understood, sitting across from him with her wrist aching, had been a performance. She'd said yes on the third ask because she was tired and lonely, and her mother had called twice that week asking about grandchildren, and sometimes the path of least resistance feels, in the moment, like wisdom. It was not wisdom. "You're not eating," Gavin said. His grip on her wrist hadn't loosened. If anything, it had shifted, his thumb pressing against the inside of her pulse point, which she suspected was intentional. "I'm not hungry," she said. "I chose this place for you. The least you can do is eat." She looked at her plate. He had ordered her the salmon. She hated salmon. She hadn't told him that. She'd barely spoken 10 words before he'd waved the waiter off. But the fact that he'd guessed wrong and served it to her anyway, that particular detail, landed somewhere specific inside her chest. Not because it was the worst thing, because it was so small. Because it was the kind of small thing that would happen every day for the rest of her life if she let it. She picked up her fork. He released her wrist. "Better," he said, and reached for his wine. Pushim. For the next 20 minutes, Lena ate salmon she didn't want and listened to Gavin talk about Gavin, his promotion, his apartment, the car he was planning to buy. He didn't ask her a single question, not about law school, not about her week, not about anything. He spoke the way a man speaks when he's already decided the conversation is a formality. When the real transaction is the fact of her presence, her compliance, her continued sitting there-ness across from him in a restaurant that was too expensive and too crowded for her to make a scene. She was calculating again. Her phone was in her jacket pocket. He hadn't taken that, at least. And her jacket was draped over the back of her chair. If she reached for it naturally, the way you reach for a phone, would he notice? He was still talking. His eyes tracked everything, though. She'd registered that early. The way his gaze swept the room every few minutes, cataloging, returning to her like a satellite locking onto a signal. She waited until he was deep into a story about a colleague who had, apparently, disrespected him at a quarterly meeting. She reached back slowly, fingers slipping into her jacket pocket. Found her phone. Kept her eyes on his face, attentive, nodding, the performance of a woman who is listening, and typed without looking. Danny, I need you to call me right now. Something is wrong. Tell them you're my sister. There's been an emergency. She sent it before she could second guess herself. Then she set the phone face down on the table, visible, normal, and picked her fork back up. Gavin didn't notice. He kept talking. 4 minutes passed. The phone didn't vibrate. Lena took a sip of water, counted the seconds. 6 minutes. Nothing. She risked a glance down. The screen was dark. She tilted it slightly. No notification, no missed call indicator. Either Danny was in the shower or she was asleep already, or... Lena looked at what she'd typed. The message had sent. The checkmark was there. But the contact name at the top wasn't Danny. The number she'd texted was 1 digit off. A 6 where there should have been a 5. She'd been texting blindly, from memory, and her memory had been wrong by 1 digit. The message had gone to a number she didn't recognize, a number not saved in her phone. She stared at it for a moment that felt much longer than it was. Then she did the only thing she could do. She typed again to the same wrong number, because at this point she had nothing to lose. I know you don't know me. I'm at Carver's on 41st, table by the window. I'm on a date with someone who scares me, and I can't leave alone. If you get this, please come, please. She hit send. Then she locked the screen and set the phone down and smiled at Gavin Mercer, who was still talking. She didn't expect anything. That's the honest truth of it. She sent the second message the way you throw a coin into a fountain, not because you believe, but because desperation has its own logic, and sometimes the only thing left to do is throw something into the dark and hope. Gavin had moved on from his story about the colleague. He was asking her now, finally asking her something, but it wasn't a real question. It was a test. He wanted to know who she'd been texting. His eyes had caught the phone movement, apparently. He was good at that, at catching things. Just my roommate, Lena said. Checking in. She worries. About what? About me. It's her thing. Gavin looked at her in a way that made her want to be somewhere else on the planet. You're with me, he said. There's nothing to worry about. I know, she said. Tell her that. I will. He picked up his wine again. She exhaled without letting it show. 20 minutes later, the door to the restaurant opened. She didn't look up immediately. She was listening to Gavin dissect the wine list. He was on his second glass and had developed opinions about the vintage that the restaurant had allegedly misrepresented. And she was nodding in the intervals where nodding seemed required. But something shifted in the room. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a commotion. It was the opposite. A kind of pressure change, the way a room feels when someone walks into it who does not walk into rooms the way most people do. Lena registered it before she saw him. The couple at the next table looked up. The hostess straightened. Even Gavin's monologue slowed by half a beat, the way you slow down when something moves in your peripheral vision that you can't immediately explain. She looked toward the door. He was tall, not extravagantly so, but tall enough that you felt it. Black suit, no tie. The jacket cut well enough that it looked like a decision rather than a dress code. Dark hair. A face that was not classically handsome, but had the kind of architecture that made you keep looking. Strong jaw, eyes that moved through the room quickly and precisely, landing on her table the way a compass needle finds north. He wasn't young, 40 maybe. The kind of 40 that doesn't apologize for itself. He said something to the hostess. She pointed. He walked. Lena watched him cross the restaurant toward her with the calm of a man who had never once rushed at anything in his life. And she felt for the first time in 2 hours something shift in her chest that was not fear. He stopped at their table. Gavin looked up. His expression did the thing expressions do when they don't know yet whether to be annoyed or deferential, that flicker of social recalibration. Can I help you? Gavin said. The man didn't answer Gavin. He looked at Lena. I got your message, he said. His voice was low. Not theatrical, just certain. Lena's throat closed. She hadn't expected this. She had sent the message expecting nothing, and here was something. Here was this man with his careful eyes standing at the edge of their table, and she had no idea who he was or what he intended to do, and she couldn't decide if she was more relieved or more terrified. I'm sorry, Gavin said, louder now. She doesn't know you. I know, the man said, still not looking at Gavin, still looking at Lena. Do you want to leave? 3 words. Not a performance, not a rescue movie line, just a question. The most direct question anyone had asked her in years, actually, and it landed in the center of her the way direct questions do when you've spent so long managing everything around the edges. Yes, she said. What happened next took less than 90 seconds, but Lena would replay it for months. Gavin stood up. He was taller than average himself, and he had the particular posture of a man who had learned early that physical presence was a negotiating tool. He drew himself up to his full height and said, voice tight and controlled, I don't know who you are or what kind of game this is, but she is here with me, and I would strongly suggest, sit down, the man said. Not loud, not a shout, not even a raised voice, just 2 words spoken in the same tone you'd use to read a street address. Flat, exact, final. Gavin blinked. Something happened in the space of that blink. Some rapid recalibration behind his eyes, some instinct that was smarter than his ego. Because he looked at the man in the black suit, and something he saw there made him close his mouth. He sat down. Lena grabbed her jacket. Her purse was on Gavin's side of the table. She hesitated for only a half second before the man picked it up, smoothly, without ceremony, and set it on the table in front of her. Ready? He said. She stood up. They walked out of Carver's together. The hostess watched them go. The couple at the next table watched them go. She was aware of eyes on her back as they passed through the door and into the cold air of the street outside. And the cold hit her face, and she realized she had been clenching every muscle in her body for the past 2 hours because the moment she hit the outside air, her knees went soft and she had to stop walking. Hey, the man said. I'm fine, she said. Give me a second. He gave her a second. She pressed her back against the exterior wall of the restaurant and breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth. A thing she'd learned in a stress management module she'd taken sophomore year that she'd thought was useless, and was now, apparently, the only thing keeping her upright. I don't know you, she said finally. No, he agreed. You got a text from a stranger asking you to come to a restaurant. Yes. And you came. He was quiet for a moment, then, you sounded like you meant it. She looked at him. He was watching the street, not her, the street, scanning it the way she'd learned over the course of the last 2 hours to recognize as surveillance. He wasn't doing it the way Gavin did it, to catalog and control. He was doing it the way... She didn't have a frame for it yet, but it was different. It felt different. Who are you? She said. He looked at her then, direct. No preamble. Roman, he said. Roman Vescari. The name meant nothing to her. She filed it anyway. Lena, she said. I know, you signed the text. She hadn't realized she'd done that. The detail embarrassed her, the instinct to be polite in the middle of a panic, and she almost laughed at it, and the almost laugh came out as something that wasn't quite either. Are you all right? He said. I don't know yet, she said honestly. He nodded, like that was a reasonable answer, like he'd expected nothing less and nothing more. My car is around the block. I'll take you home if you want, or I can call you a car. Whichever you prefer. You don't have to. I'm aware, he said. She let him call her a car. She sat on a bench 30 feet from the restaurant's entrance while he stood a few feet away with his phone, and she watched the door of Carver's in case Gavin came out, and Gavin did not come out. She didn't know why. She didn't know what Roman had communicated in those 90 seconds at the table that had made a man like Gavin Mercer sit back down and stay there, and she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Not tonight. The car came in 4 minutes. Black, clean, not a rideshare, a car service. Roman opened the door. It's paid, he said. He knows the address. Give him yours when you're ready. She stopped with one hand on the doorframe. Why did you come? She said. Honestly, you don't know me. He looked at her for a moment, and she had the sense, not an uncomfortable sense, just a real one, of being actually seen. Not assessed, not measured, seen. Because you asked, he said. She got in his car. She watched him through the rear window as the driver pulled away from the curb. He stood on the sidewalk with his hands in his jacket pockets, watching the car go. And he did not wave, and she did not wave, And the last thing she saw before the block turned was the shape of him standing very still in the dark. And then he was gone. What? Lena got home at 10:17. She sat on the edge of her bed for a long time without turning on more lights, and she looked at her phone, at the conversation thread with the wrong number, with Roman Vescari, and she read her own messages back to herself. I know you don't know me. I'm on a date with someone who scares me, and I can't leave alone. She had sent that to a stranger. She had been so frightened that she had sent that to a stranger, and the stranger had come. She typed, "Thank you. I'm home." She stared at the message for a long moment before she sent it. The reply came 11 minutes later. "Good. Lock your door." That was all. She did what it said. And then she lay down on her bed with her jacket still on and her shoes still on, and she stared at the ceiling and she thought about the way he'd said, "Do you want to leave?" Not, "Do you need help?" Not, "Is there a problem?" Not, "Are you okay?" Just the clean, direct question of it, stripped of performance and theater and the noise that usually surrounds people trying to help and also trying to be seen helping. "Do you want to leave?" "Yes," she had said. And she had. She closed her eyes. 2 miles across the city, in an apartment she would not see for weeks yet, Roman Vescari sat at a desk in a room with very few personal objects and looked at his phone and at the message, "Thank you. I'm home." And he sat with that for a moment in a way that he did not entirely understand. Then he put the phone down. He went back to work. But he did not delete the number. The first thing Gavin did was send 11 texts before midnight. Lena knew this because she woke up at 12:04 in the morning, still in her jacket and her shoes, and reached for her phone out of reflex, the way you do when sleep comes fast and hard after something that has wrung you out. And she saw the notifications stacked on her screen like a wall someone had built while she wasn't looking. She didn't open them. She read the previews. "You embarrassed me in front of the entire restaurant. Who was that man? I deserve to know. I'm not angry. I just need you to explain. Lena. Lena, I know you're awake. That was incredibly disrespectful, and I think you owe me an apology. I'm not the kind of man you want as an enemy. Answer me. Answer me. Fine. I'll give you tonight. But we need to talk tomorrow. I'm sorry for how the evening went. I think we got off to a rough start. Let me make it up to you." She read the last one twice. The pivot from, "I'm not the kind of man you want as an enemy," to "Let me make it up to you." The distance between those two messages was 4 minutes and 30 seconds. She'd checked the timestamps. 4 minutes and 30 seconds to decide that threat hadn't worked and to try something softer. The calculation of it sat in her stomach like something she'd eaten wrong. She blocked the number. Then she lay back down and stared at the ceiling and thought about Roman Vescari and his 2-word instruction, "Lock your door." And the way it had not felt like a command. She couldn't explain the difference, only that there was one. She slept badly and woke up tired and went to her 8 a.m. contracts class with coffee she'd made too strong and notes she couldn't focus on. And halfway through a discussion on consideration doctrine, her phone buzzed on the desk with a call from a number she didn't know. She let it go to voicemail. The voicemail was Gavin's voice, coming through her blocked number on what was clearly a second phone. Calm this time. Measured. The voice of a man who had slept and recalculated. "Hey, I know you're probably still upset. That's fair. I just want a chance to talk in person. I think there was a misunderstanding and I'm willing to take responsibility for my part in it. Call me back when you're ready." She deleted it without finishing it. What? The second week after Carver's, the flowers appeared. Not a delivery. Not a florist's arrangement with a card and a bow. These were left outside her apartment door, on the mat, in the morning, before she woke up. A bundle of white lilies, no card, no wrapping. Just placed there with the particular care of someone who wanted her to know they knew where she lived. She stood in her doorway in her socks and looked at them for a long moment. Then she stepped over them and went to class. She told her roommate Petra, who worked the overnight shift at a hospital 3 nights a week and was therefore frequently either asleep or exhausted. Petra was on the couch eating cereal when Lena described the flowers, and she said, "You need to tell someone official." Tell them what? A man left flowers. Tell them the context. The context is that I went on one date with someone I didn't like and left. Petra pointed her spoon. You texted a stranger for help because he scared you. That's the context. Start there. Lena didn't answer. She knew Petra was right. She also knew what happened when women reported feelings. Not bruises, not recordings, not documented evidence, just feelings. to the administrative bodies of universities and the underfunded offices of campus security. She was a law student. She knew how thin the paper was between "he makes me uncomfortable" and "we can do something about that." The flowers kept coming, every morning for 9 days. She stopped stepping over them and started throwing them directly in the building's trash before she went upstairs, which meant she had to leave earlier than she wanted to, which meant she was tired and irritable in a low-grade chronic way that she didn't talk about to anyone except Petra. On the 10th morning, there were no flowers. On the 10th morning, Gavin was standing on the sidewalk outside her building. I was dressed well. That was the first thing she registered. The deliberate presentability of it, the gray coat and the clean shoes and the hair that had been done intentionally. He was holding 2 coffees. He looked like a man who had prepared for a conversation. Lena stopped walking when she saw him. She was 10 feet from the building's exterior door, which was 20 feet from where he was standing, and the math of it was bad. "I just want to talk," he said. His voice was open, reasonable. The performance was very good. 5 minutes, that's all. "You need to leave," she said. "Lena, I blocked your number. That's not a starting point for a conversation. That's an answer." Something moved in his face. Not much. A tightening around the eyes, a slight compression of his jaw. But she was starting to learn how to read the small movements. "You're being dramatic," he said, and the reasonableness dropped by 1 precise degree. "I'm going to be late," she said. And she walked toward the door, and she kept her eyes forward, and she felt him track her the entire way to the entrance. He didn't follow. He said her name once, from behind her, in a tone she didn't like, and then the door closed between them, and she stood in the lobby with her heart going at twice its normal rate, and her hands completely steady, because she had learned a long time ago that her hands stayed steady when she was scared and only shook when she was angry, and right now she was both. She stood there for 45 seconds before she pushed through to the stairs. That afternoon, she opened the conversation thread with Roman Vescari for the first time since the night he'd responded to her text. She didn't type anything. She just looked at the exchange. His message, "Good, lock your door," sitting at the bottom of it with a timestamp of 10:41 p.m. from a week ago. She typed, "He was outside my building this morning." She stared at it. She deleted it. She typed, "Can I ask you something?" She stared at that one longer. She deleted that too. She put the phone in her bag and went to the library and spent 3 hours on an appellate brief that she revised 4 times because she couldn't make herself concentrate. And then she went home and Gavin was not outside the building, and she felt the particular exhaustion of having been afraid and then not needing to be afraid and not being able to relax into the relief because she knew it was temporary. At 9:15, her phone buzzed. "Roman Vescar, you still good?" She stared at it. She typed back, "How did you know to check in?" The reply took 2 minutes. "I didn't, just did." She sat with that for a moment. Then, "He showed up outside my building today. He's been leaving things at my door." The typing indicator appeared, disappeared, appeared again. "What things?" "Flowers. 9 days of them. No card." A pause. Then, "Has he touched you?" "No. He stood on the sidewalk. He said he just wanted to talk." "Don't talk to him." "I know. Don't engage. Don't explain yourself. Don't tell him to stop. Any response is data for him." She read that 3 times. The specificity of it, the understanding of the mechanism, the way it named the thing she'd been instinctively doing, landed in her chest. "How do you know that?" she typed. The pause this time was longer. "I've seen it before," he wrote, "from both sides." She didn't know what to do with that. She let it sit. "What does that mean?" she finally typed. "It means I'll look into it," he wrote. "Don't worry about the details." Roman. "Yes. Who are you actually?" The longest pause yet. She watched the screen. "Someone who showed up when you texted," he wrote finally. That's enough for now. It wasn't enough. She knew it wasn't enough. But she also knew that pushing through a text thread at 9:15 at night wasn't how she was going to get a real answer, and she had the instinct, fragile, untested, that real answers from Roman Vescari were not things he surrendered through pressure. They were things he gave when he decided to give them. "Okay," she wrote. "Lock your door," he wrote back. The repetition of it, the same instruction, steady as a landmark, did something she couldn't entirely account for. She locked her door. 3 days later, the flowers stopped. She didn't know why. She didn't ask Roman, but she thought about asking. And the thought itself was significant because she was thinking about him more than was perhaps warranted for a man she'd met once in a restaurant and exchanged a handful of texts with. She was a precise thinker. She knew how to examine her own reasoning. She looked at what she was doing, reaching toward this stranger in her mind, replaying the 90 seconds in Carver's, the flat certainty of his voice when he'd said, "Sit down." And she asked herself what she was actually doing, and she answered herself honestly. She was drawn to him. That was uncomfortable to admit because the timing was wrong and the context was wrong. And she didn't know enough about him to know if it was anything beyond gratitude wearing a more complicated costume. But she'd learned in 2 years of law school that refusing to name a thing doesn't change its nature. And the thing had a name. And its name was that she was thinking about Roman Vescari more than made sense. She went for a run on a Thursday morning, the first run she'd managed in 2 weeks, because her schedule had contracted around the anxiety of Gavin without her fully realizing it, and she ran 4 miles through the kind of cold that made her lungs work twice as hard. And by the 3rd mile, she'd stopped thinking about Gavin Mercer at all. And by the 4th, she was thinking clearly for the first time in 2 weeks. And what she was thinking clearly about was that she needed to talk to Roman in person. She texted him when she got back, "Can I buy you coffee?" to say thank you properly. He took 4 hours to respond. She had almost convinced herself he wasn't going to when her phone buzzed. Saturday, 10 o'clock. There's a place called Morrow's on Clement Street. Not fancy. She smiled at her phone in a way that she did not show anyone. "Not fancy is fine," she wrote back. Morrow's was a diner, strictly speaking. Booths with red vinyl seats that had seen better decades, a counter with spinning stools, the smell of coffee that had been on the burner long enough to develop opinions. Lena got there at 9:55 and took a booth by the window and ordered coffee she didn't need and watched the street. Roman arrived at exactly 10. He was in a different suit, charcoal this time, no jacket, just the trousers and a dark sweater that looked like it cost more than her monthly grocery budget. And he moved through the diner the way she remembered, with the particular quality of a man whose presence adjusts the atmosphere of a room without any visible effort. He slid into the booth across from her, looked at her coffee cup. "You started without me," he said. "You were on time. I was early. It's a character flaw." Something moved in his face. Not a smile exactly, but the equipment for one. The waitress came. He ordered black coffee, nothing else. Lena watched how he did it. Brief, polite, direct, not the performance of courtesy but the actual thing, and filed it. "The flowers stopped," she said when the waitress left. "Yes." "You had something to do with that." He looked at her. "You said he was making you uncomfortable." "I did. I didn't ask you to do anything about it." "No." He picked up the coffee that had appeared, which she hadn't tracked the arrival of. "You didn't." She leaned forward slightly. "What did you do?" "Had a conversation. With Gavin. With someone who speaks a language Gavin understands." The phrasing of it stopped her. She turned it over. "What language is that?" Roman set his cup down. He looked at her directly, the way he had in the restaurant. Not through her, not at a point behind her head. At her, which was rarer than it should be. "Consequence," he said. "He understands consequence. Most men like him do." "Most men like him," she repeated. "You've known men like him." "Yes." "What kind of world do you live in, Roman, where you've known enough men like that to have a framework for them?" A long pause. The diner moved around them, the clatter of plates, someone's kid asking for more syrup. And Roman Viscari sat very still in it, the way a tree sits still in wind. "A complicated one," he said finally. "That's not an answer." "I know." "What?" She didn't push. Something, instinct, or the particular intelligence of knowing when you're at a wall, kept her back from it. They talked for an hour instead, about law school, which she described precisely and without flattery. The exhaustion of it, the cases that stayed with her, the professor who made evidence class feel like actual forensics, and the one who made contract theory feel like slow death. He listened the way people don't, in general, listen, without reaching for his phone, without composing his response while she was still talking, without the particular performance of listening that is actually just waiting. He said very little about himself. She gathered small things, that he ran several businesses, that he traveled, that he had an office in the financial district that he described as functional in a tone that suggested he had thought about the word before using it. He mentioned a brother once and then did not mention him again. He said he had not grown up in this city, and when she asked where he had grown up, he smiled, a real one, brief and asymmetric, and said, complicated. You say that a lot, she said, because it keeps being true. She walked out of Morrow's at 11:20 into cold winter light and stood on the sidewalk while he stood a few feet away, and the distance between them had the quality of something that wanted to be shorter. Thank you, she said, for coming to Carver's, for the other thing, whatever it was. He nodded. Will you tell me eventually, she said, who you actually are? He looked at the street for a moment, then back at her. Probably, he said. When you actually want to know. She opened her mouth to say she did want to know, and then she stopped because she understood, from the careful precision of his phrasing, that he was not being evasive. He was telling her something. He was telling her that there was a version of wanting to know that was curiosity, and there was a version that was something else, and he could tell the difference, and he was waiting for the second one. She didn't have an answer for that. So she said, I'll see you, and walked to the corner and turned it, and she didn't look back, but she was aware of him watching her go, and it did not feel like surveillance. It felt like something else entirely. Gavin Mercer waited 2.5 weeks before he escalated again. Lena had begun to relax, which was the first mistake. Or not a mistake exactly, because she'd needed the space to breathe, and you cannot live in maximum alertness without the cost of it eating through you. But relaxing had allowed her to stop scanning, and stopping scanning meant she didn't see him until he was 6 feet behind her on the path between the law school's main building and the library. She heard her name. She knew the voice before she turned. He was in a coat she didn't recognize, and he'd cut his hair, and he had the careful composure of someone who had spent time rehearsing this moment. I'm not here to start anything, he said, hands slightly raised, palms visible. The performed gesture of non-threat that was itself a threat by virtue of its performance. I just want 5 minutes. Gavin, 5 minutes, then I'm gone. I promise. Around them, the path was not empty. Other students moved past, heads down in their phones and their coffee. And she was aware of exactly how public they were, and she was aware that public was not the same as safe, and she was aware that he had chosen this location and this timing deliberately. There's nothing to say, she said. I think there is. He stepped forward, not close enough to be clearly threatening. He was too calculated for that, but close enough that she had to hold ground to stay where she was. She held it. You embarrassed me, he said, the careful composure slipping by a single degree. In front of people, with a man you apparently know well enough to text in secret, and I think I deserve an explanation. You don't. Lena, the way he said her name, possession in 2 syllables. I have been incredibly patient. I know, she said. You have. And I'm telling you that patience isn't going to produce a different answer. We went on a date. It didn't work. That's the end of it. It's not the end of it. It is. He looked at her with something that had dropped the last pretense of reasonableness. And she saw, for the first time in this conversation, his actual face. Not the composed version, not the patient version, but the version underneath it that had been there at the table in Carver's when he told her she was going to have something to remember. You don't get to just walk away from me, he said, very quiet. That's not how this works. Her phone was in her pocket. Her fingers found it without her consciously directing them to. She didn't text Roman. She thought about it. The reflex of it was there. But she stopped herself because she was not going to become someone who couldn't handle her own terrain. She was a law student. She knew words. She used them. If you come near me again, she said, level, clear, each word placed like a brick, I will file for a restraining order. I have documented every communication you've sent since the night I blocked you. I have dates and times and content. That is the entire record of what you have done, and it is already enough. Do you understand me? He stared at her. Do you understand me? She said again. Something shifted in him, a recalibration, the same one she'd seen in the restaurant when he looked at Roman and sat down. The instinct that was smarter than his ego. He straightened, pulled his coat closed, looked at her with eyes that had gone very flat. You're making a mistake, he said. I've noted your opinion, she said. He walked away. She stood on the path and watched him until he was out of sight around the corner of the building, And then she stood there for 30 more seconds because she needed the seconds. And then she walked to the library and found a table in the back corner and sat down and put her head in her hands. Her hands were shaking. There it was. The anger. She called Petra instead of texting Roman, and Petra answered on the third ring, sounding like she'd just woken up from a post-shift sleep. And Lena talked for 6 minutes straight without stopping, and Petra listened. And when Lena was done, Petra said, "You need to actually file." "I know. Not think about filing, actually file." "I know, Petra. And you need to tell that Roman person." Lena was quiet. "Lena, we've had coffee once. He came to a restaurant for a stranger. He clearly has resources you don't have. Tell him." She told him. She texted it. Just the facts, flat, no drama. "Gavin approached me on campus today. Not physically threatening, but persistent. I told him about the restraining order. He said I was making a mistake." The reply came in under a minute. That was new. The speed of it. "Where are you right now?" "Library." "I'm okay. Stay in public. Don't walk home alone tonight." "Roman, I'm not asking you to be scared. I'm asking you to be smart." She stared at that. The distinction mattered. "Okay," she typed. "I'll have someone make sure the walk is clear," he wrote. "You won't see them." She read that sentence 3 times. "What does that mean?" she typed. "You'll have someone." A pause. "It means what it means." "Roman, what do you do?" "We'll talk," he wrote. "Not tonight, but we'll talk." It was not an evasion. She had learned, in their hour at Moro's, to tell the difference between Roman Vescari evading and Roman Vescari postponing. He postponed things until he was ready to say them fully. It was, she was beginning to understand, a form of respect. The refusal to hand someone a partial truth and let them fill in the rest with whatever they were most afraid of. "Okay," she typed. "Thank you." She put her phone away and opened her laptop and looked at the restraining order application she had already half-drafted 3 days ago, and she opened it fully, and she began to complete it with the particular focus of someone who is turning fear into paperwork, which is one of the few forms of alchemy that actually works. She filed it the next morning. 2 days later, Gavin was served. She knew because the process server sent confirmation to her attorney, a senior student at the law school's legal aid clinic who'd agreed to supervise the paperwork. And the confirmation arrived at 2 in the afternoon on a Thursday, and Lena sat with it on her phone screen in the middle of the law library's reading room and felt not triumphant but tired in a way that went past sleep. That evening, Roman texted her. "It's done." She wrote back, "I know, my attorney confirmed." "No," he wrote. "The other thing," she frowned. "What other thing?" "I had his employer contacted. Some financial irregularities were brought to HR's attention." She sat very still. "What irregularities?" she wrote. "Real ones," he wrote. "I don't fabricate." There were real irregularities. Someone just made sure the right people saw them. She didn't type for a long time, long enough that the typing indicator must have appeared and disappeared several times on his end. "Roman." "Yes." "How did you know to look?" "I had him looked at," he wrote simply. "After the restaurant. It's what I do when something matters." She put her phone face down on the table. She picked it back up. "I don't know whether to be grateful or frightened," she typed. His response was immediate this time. "I know," he wrote. "That's the right response. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." She sat with that in the library for a long time, surrounded by other students who were studying contracts and torts and civil procedure, all of them working through the architecture of a world that ran on rules and precedent and documented evidence. And she sat in the middle of it, knowing that somewhere outside of all that architecture was a man who operated in the spaces where the rules didn't reach, and he had reached into one of those spaces on her behalf. And she did not know whether that made her safer or whether it made her something she didn't have a word for yet. She thought about what he'd said at Moro's, "When you actually want to know." She was beginning to understand what he meant. She picked up her phone and typed, "I think I'm ready to hear who you actually are." The reply took 11 minutes. "Come to the address I'm going to send you. Sunday, 7 p.m. Bring your questions. I'll answer as many as I can." An address followed. She put it into her Maps application. It resolved to a building in the financial district, a tower, glass and steel, the kind of building that had a lobby with security and a directory with names she didn't recognize. She looked at it for a long time. Then she wrote, Okay. She closed her laptop. The restraining order was filed. Gavin's career was fracturing somewhere she couldn't see. Roman Vescari was waiting at the end of a Sunday she hadn't reached yet with answers she'd asked for and wasn't entirely sure she was prepared to hear. There was no version of Lena Ashcroft who was going to back away from that. She packed her bag and walked out of the library into an evening that had gone full dark while she wasn't paying attention. And halfway down the first block she became aware, in a way she couldn't entirely explain, of a presence on the far side of the street, steady, pacing, at a distance that kept her in sight without being visible unless you were looking. She was looking. She couldn't make out a face, just a shape, a man, large, keeping pace. She stopped. The shape stopped. She started walking. The shape started walking. She thought about what Roman had said. I'll have someone make sure the walk is clear. You won't see them. She hadn't seen them until now. She pulled her jacket tighter and kept walking, and the shape kept pace across the street all the way to her building's front door. And when she got inside and looked back through the glass, the far side of the street was empty. She stood in the lobby for a moment. Then she pressed the elevator button, and when the doors opened, she stepped in, and as they closed, she thought, whatever Roman Vescari is about to tell her on Sunday is going to change something she cannot yet name, and she is going to go anyway, because she has been afraid of Gavin Mercer for weeks, and she has never once been afraid of Roman. Not in the restaurant, not in the diner, not on the phone at 9:15 in the evening. And that fact either says everything about him or everything about her, and she suspects it says something about both. The elevator reached her floor. The doors opened. She walked to her apartment, and she unlocked the door, and she went inside, and for the first time in weeks she did not check behind her before she closed it. Sunday arrived the way difficult things often do. Unremarkably, with ordinary light through ordinary curtains, no signal from the atmosphere that anything was about to shift. Lena dressed carefully. Not formally, she wasn't going to perform anything, but deliberately, the way you dress when you suspect you're going to need to feel like yourself. Dark jeans. A gray sweater that was soft enough to be comfortable and structured enough to be armor. Her good coat. She stood in front of the bathroom mirror for longer than she needed to and looked at the person looking back and said, quietly, to no one, you asked for this. She had. She'd asked for it, and it was waiting for her at 7 p.m. in a building in the financial district, and she was going. The building was called Vescari Holdings on the directory in the lobby, which she had not noticed in the Maps application but registered now with a specific weight, that his name was on the building, that the building was his, that the scale of what she was walking into had a shape she was only beginning to see. The lobby security knew her name before she said it. A man in a dark jacket. Not a uniform, just a jacket, but the posture underneath it was a uniform of its own, said Ms. Ashcroft, and directed her to an elevator that required a key card he swiped without handing her, and the elevator went to the 19th floor without stopping. The doors opened into a space that was not what she expected. She had braced for ostentation, the kind of office that announces money through marble and height and deliberate minimalism that costs more than abundance would. What she got was functional. Roman's word, she remembered. A large room with a conference table that had papers on it, 2 computers, bookshelves with actual books that had actual wear on their spines, and windows that looked across the financial district to where the city spread out in the dark, like something spilled. A couch against one wall that looked like it had been slept on. A coffee machine on a sideboard that was on. Roman was standing at the windows when the elevator opened. He turned. He was in a dark shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows, no jacket. This was, she was beginning to realize, his actual register. Not the tailored performance of Carver's, but this, working late in a room that was his, the version of him that didn't account for audience. You came, he said. I said I would. He gestured toward the conference table. Coffee? Please. They went through the small choreography of it, him pouring, her sitting, the cup set in front of her, him taking the chair across the corner rather than directly across from her, which she noted as a choice. And then there was a moment where they were both still, and the city moved outside the windows, and neither of them said anything. Ask, he said. She put her hands around the cup. Who was your father? He didn't react visibly. Why start there? Because I looked up your name this week. There's almost nothing. A few corporate filings, some real estate transfers, one profile in a financial journal from 4 years ago that says almost nothing personal. But there's a name, Ettore Viscari, and that name has a different kind of search result. Roman looked at her steadily. What kind? The kind that involves federal investigations that didn't produce charges. The kind that mentions business associates who had subsequent legal difficulties. The kind that uses the phrase alleged organized interests in a way that's very careful about what it's alleging. Silence. He was my father, Roman said. He built this company. He built several other things alongside it that were not this, not legitimate. Criminal. Yes, she held that. And you inherited everything. He said it without flinching. The legitimate operations and the other kind. I was 26. I had a choice about what to do with both. What did you do? I kept the legitimate operations. The rest? He paused, and she watched him choose words the way a careful man chooses them, not for softness, but for precision. The rest I've been managing down. For 14 years. It's not a fast process. Managing down, she repeated. What does that mean specifically? It means that the people and structures my father built don't dissolve because you want them to. They dissolve because you systematically remove their profitability, relocate their operations, and replace their leadership with people who have legitimate interests in going legitimate. It takes time. It takes the willingness to be inside something ugly while you work from the inside. Are you still inside something ugly? He looked at her directly. Yes, he said. Less than I was. More than I want to be. The honesty of it arrived without ceremony. That was, she was discovering, his consistent mode. Not confession, not performance, not the strategic vulnerability of someone who has calculated exactly how much truth to deploy. Just the actual thing, delivered flat, as if he had decided somewhere along the way that the only dignity available to him was in not lying about what he was. The man who followed me home last week, she said. Marcus. He works for me. I was making sure you were safe. He works for you in what capacity? Security. Security for what kind of organization? Roman leaned back slightly. The kind that has security. Roman. Lena. He said her name the same way she'd said his, not a deflection, just a recognition that they were at the edge of something. What I'm telling you is that my father ran operations that touched things you would find criminal, and that I find criminal, and that I have spent 14 years trying to extract myself and this company from. What I'm not going to do is give you a ledger of every specific activity, because some of that information is genuinely dangerous, and I don't want to make you a person who knows things that could... He stopped. Could what? She said. Could make you a target. For people who are not me. The room was very quiet. What kind of people? She said, and her voice was level because her hands were shaking under the table. The kind my father made agreements with, he said. The kind who view those agreements as inheritable, as permanent. The kind who have been watching my 14-year extraction project with significant unhappiness, and who, as I have gotten closer to fully clean, have gotten increasingly motivated to do something about it. She looked at him. You're telling me you're in danger. I'm telling you the situation is complicated. You keep using that word. It keeps being accurate. She stood up. Not because she was leaving, she didn't know yet if she was leaving, but because she needed to not be sitting. She walked to the windows and looked at the city and stood there with the glass cold in front of her and her own reflection hovering over the lights below. In the restaurant, she said to the glass. You came because I texted. You said it was because I sounded like I meant it. A pause. But Marcus, you had Marcus watching. Before I even texted again. Before coffee. You already knew where I lived. Silence behind her. She turned. Roman's face was not comfortable. After the restaurant, he said, I had you looked at, briefly. Standard protocol, when I'm involved in a situation I don't understand. Standard protocol. Yes. And what does standard protocol look like? Name, address, occupation, any known threats, nothing intrusive. She held that. And then you kept Marcus in rotation. After you told me about Gavin, yes. Without telling me. Yes. He didn't look away. I judged that telling you would either alarm you unnecessarily or make you refuse the help. I may have been wrong about that. She laughed, a short, hard sound that was not humor. You may have been wrong about that. I know how it sounds. Do you? She walked back to the table but didn't sit. I'm a law student, Roman. I spend 8 hours a day studying frameworks that exist specifically to prevent people from doing exactly what you just described, surveilling someone without their knowledge or consent, using information gathered without disclosure, deploying private security in someone's life without, I know, he said, and your response is, I may have been wrong. Yes. His voice had not changed, not defensive, not apologetic in the performed sense, just steady in the way of something that has already accepted the terms of its own weight. Because I may have been. I made a judgment call under circumstances where I had incomplete information and a woman who was scared and a man who had a pattern I recognized. I would make the same call again. I'm not going to pretend otherwise to make this easier. She stared at him. That's extraordinarily honest, she said. It's the only thing I have to offer you, he said. I'm not going to perform remorse I don't feel. I do think you should have been told. I don't think I would have done it differently. She sat down. They looked at each other across the corner of a conference table in a 19th floor office at 7:30 on a Sunday evening while the city moved outside, and somewhere below them, the structures of his father's life were still, in some partial measure, breathing. Tell me the rest, she said. He told her for 90 minutes, not everything. He'd warned her about that, and she believed the warning. But enough. The shape of his father's empire. Logistics companies that were fronts, investment vehicles that laundered, alliances with 3 distinct organizations across 2 states that had names she wouldn't be told, and whose current leadership was, in several cases, engaged in active federal investigation. The 14-year project, the legitimate companies, now genuinely profitable and genuinely clean, which employed over 400 people and had no operational connection to anything his father had built in the dark. The remaining entanglements, 2 contracts that couldn't be cleanly voided without triggering responses from the men who held the other end. Men who were watching Roman's legitimization with the patience of people who had time and the threat of people who didn't need it. She listened without interrupting. She asked 3 questions, each precise, each aimed at the specific architecture of what he was describing rather than the emotional surface of it. He answered all 3 fully. When he finished, the coffee had gone cold. Gavin's employer, she said, the financial irregularities you surfaced. Yes. Was that connected to any of this? He shook his head. Gavin Mercer is a small man who likes control and got sloppy with expense accounts. That had nothing to do with my world. I looked at him because he was a problem for you. The irregularities were already there. I just made sure the right people looked in the right drawer. And the restraining order. That's yours. I didn't touch that. Why not? He tilted his head slightly. Because you filed it yourself. That matters. That's yours. She looked at him for a long moment. There was something in the precision of that distinction. The restraining order is yours. The other thing, I did. That told her more about who he was than the 90 minutes of operational detail had. What happens? She said carefully. If someone connected to your father's world finds out about me. Roman was quiet for exactly the length of time that told her he had already thought about this. That's why I'm telling you all of this, he said, because you need to know the risk before you decide what you want to do with any of it. What I want to do with it, she repeated. With knowing me, he said. Plain, clean, no decoration on it. She looked at the window, at the city, at her own faint reflection in the glass. I'm not afraid of you, she said. I know. I'm not sure if that's wisdom or stupidity on my part. Probably neither, he said. Probably left at 9:40. He walked her to the elevator, and the elevator went down, and the lobby security nodded, and she pushed through the glass doors into the cold and stood on the sidewalk and breathed. She stood there for a full minute. Then she started walking. She was 3 blocks from the building, turning onto a street that would take her to the subway, when her phone rang. Unknown number. Not Gavin's pattern, different area code. She almost didn't answer. She answered. Ms. Ashcroft. A man's voice. Not young. The kind of voice that belonged to someone who had made many phone calls and knew exactly what they were doing with each one. I apologize for the late hour. My name isn't important. What's important is that I know you just spent the evening with Roman Viscari, and I think you should know some things about that meeting that he did not tell you. She stopped walking. Her heartbeat did not spike. It dropped. the way it did when she was shifting into the mode that meant she was processing rather than reacting. "Who are you?" she said. "Someone who has known Roman Vescari for a long time. Someone who has an interest in the choices he makes." A pause. "He told you about his father's business." Not a question. "He told you he was in the process of extracting himself from certain obligations." Another pause. "What he did not tell you is that the extraction timeline he described to you is not the timeline he has communicated to the people he is extracting from. That he has made promises in two directions simultaneously. That the men who hold the other end of those two remaining contracts believe they have a very different agreement than the one he described to you tonight." She was standing absolutely still on the sidewalk. "What does that mean?" she said. "It means Roman Vescari has been operating a deception," the man said. "Not against you, against them. He has been telling his father's associates that the legitimate business is a cover, that it exists to generate clean income that eventually flows back to the network. He has been maintaining those relationships under false pretenses for 14 years because it was the only way to keep both worlds stable while he worked. The men who believe they have an agreement with him believe it completely. When they discover the reality, and they will discover it because some of them are already beginning to, the response will be significant." Her throat was dry. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. "Because you are about to become relevant to that response," the man said. "You are someone Roman Vescari has taken an interest in. In his world, that makes you a pressure point. The men I am describing do not hesitate to use pressure points." A long pause. The street around her was ordinary. A couple walking a dog, the sound of traffic 2 blocks over, the specific silence of a city that is never actually silent. "What do you want?" she said. "I want you to walk away from Roman Vescari," the man said, "before the situation becomes one you cannot walk away from." The call ended. She stood on the sidewalk with her phone in her hand and the city doing what it always did around her, and she thought very clearly and very precisely, someone just tried to frighten me away from him. She thought about who would want to do that. She thought about this man's voice, not threatening, not aggressive, careful and measured. And she thought about the information he had offered, which was specific enough to be credible and structured perfectly to produce maximum doubt. She called Roman. He answered in 2 rings. "Someone just called me," she said. 3 blocks from your building, unknown number. He knew I was with you tonight." A silence that was not surprise, it was recognition. "What did he say?" Roman said. She told him. All of it, verbatim, because she had a law student's memory for exact language, and because exactness mattered. When she finished, Roman said nothing for 4 seconds. "Go home," he said, directly. "Don't stop." "Roman, is it true?" "What he said?" "About the 2 directions." A pause. "Some of it," he said. She closed her eyes briefly. "Which part?" "Not tonight," he said. "Go home. I need to make some calls. I will explain everything tomorrow. I need you somewhere safe first." "Roman." "Lena." His voice had changed, not louder, not harder, but stripped of everything except urgency. "Please. I will explain everything, but I need you to be inside with the door locked before I can think about anything else. Please." She started walking. What? She got home. She locked the door. She sat on the edge of her bed in her good coat and her deliberate clothes, and she looked at the wall and she thought. She thought about what Roman had said, some of it. Not a denial, not an explanation, a partial confirmation issued under pressure with the explanation deferred. She thought about the unknown caller, about the precision of the timing, 3 blocks from the building, meaning he'd been watching the building, meaning he'd known she was there before she walked out. That was surveillance. That was resources. That was a person with the capacity to monitor Roman's building and her movements simultaneously. She thought about what Roman had told her in the office. The men who have been watching my 14-year extraction project with significant unhappiness. She thought about the phrase increasingly motivated to do something about it. She was starting to understand the geometry of the situation. Roman had spent 14 years telling his father's associates one thing and doing another. Not a clean deception, not a simple lie, but the necessary complexity of a man trying to dismantle something dangerous without triggering its defenses. And it had worked for 14 years, because the men on the other end believed they still had a partner. And the reason they still believed it was because Roman had maintained the performance of it, had gone to meetings she didn't know about, had spoken the language of the world he was exiting, had kept one foot in a room he was trying to leave without them noticing the door, and now someone had called her, which meant those men either knew about her or suspected about her, and either way they had reached toward her as a lever. Her phone buzzed. "Roman, are you inside?" She typed, "Yes." "Roman, thank you. I'll be there in the morning, 7 a.m., if that's all right." She stared at that. "You'll be here. I need to explain in person. Some of it isn't. Text doesn't do it. Is 7 all right?" "Yes," she typed. She lay down on her bed without taking her coat off and looked at the ceiling and thought about the man on the phone and his careful voice and the specific word he had used, relevant. She thought about what it meant to become relevant to something you never chose to be near. Her phone buzzed again. Not Roman this time. The number was Gavin's. Not the block number, a new one, the third phone in as many weeks. And the text was 3 words. "I know everything." She sat up. Her fingers went cold. She typed back. Not because she'd forgotten Roman's instructions about not engaging, but because this was different, because 3 words with no context in the middle of a night that had already produced one threatening call was not a thing she could ignore. "What do you mean?" The response came in under 10 seconds. "I mean, I've been talking to some very interesting people about your new friend Roman Viscari. I know what he is. I know what you're standing next to. And I mean that if you think a restraining order is going to be the most significant problem in your life right now, you have underestimated the situation." She read it twice. Then she read it a third time. Gavin. Gavin Mercer, small man, expense account fraud, curated confidence, had been talking to people about Roman, which meant Gavin had found something, or been found, or been used, which meant that the man on the phone and Gavin's suddenly aggressive knowledge were not 2 separate events tonight. They were the same event. Someone had gotten to Gavin, someone with a reason to use every available lever. She called Roman. He picked up before the first ring finished, which told her he'd been waiting. "Gavin texted me," she said. "New number. He says he's been talking to people about you. He says he knows what you are." The silence on his end lasted exactly long enough. "Roman," she said, "talk to me." "I'm coming now," he said. "Not in the morning. Now." "What's happening?" "Something I was hoping to have more time to manage." A sound in the background. Movement. A door. "Gavin is not the problem. Gavin has been contacted by the people I told you about tonight. They found him because they found you, and they found you because of me, and I—" He stopped. "Say it," she said. "I'm sorry," he said. And the word landed differently from him than it would have from most people, because she already understood that Roman Viscari did not deploy apology as performance. "I brought this toward you. I didn't intend to, but intention doesn't change the geometry. I brought it toward you and I need to fix it." She was standing in the middle of her apartment with her coat still on, and the city outside her window going about its unconcerned business, and a situation that had, in the space of 4 hours, acquired a shape she hadn't seen coming. "How bad is it?" she said. A pause. "It's manageable," he said. "Roman." "It's bad," he said. "But it's manageable. I need you to trust me for tonight." She stood there. She thought about the last 2 months. Gavin's grip on her wrist, the wrong number, the man in the black suit crossing a restaurant toward her. "Do you want to leave?" Coffee at Moro's, 90 minutes of honest architecture in a 19th floor office, some of it. And now this, a phone call from a shadow, a text from a man being used as a weapon, and Roman's voice on the other end saying, "It's bad, but it's manageable," with the particular weight of someone who is very accustomed to deciding what is and is not his to carry. "I trust you," she said. And that was the truth, and the truth of it frightened her more than anything else that had happened tonight, because trusting Roman Viscari was not a small thing she could walk back from. It was the kind of choice that, once made, reorganized everything that came after it. He arrived 19 minutes later. She opened the door and he was standing in the hallway in his dark shirt with his sleeves still rolled and his face carrying something she recognized from the restaurant, that specific quality of a man who has assessed a room and understood exactly what it requires. Except this time the room was her apartment, and the thing it required was something neither of them had a clean word for yet. "Come in," she said. He came in. And when the door closed behind him, Lena Ashcroft understood, with the clarity that arrives not gradually but all at once, like cold water, that she had stopped being a woman who had texted the wrong number and started being something else entirely, something that would require more of her than she had yet been asked to give, and that she was not going to step back from it. She had chosen this. In the kitchen, the wrong number that had started all of it sat in her phone's memory, and outside her window, the city moved in its indifferent sprawl. And inside her apartment, a man who carried the weight of 14 years of careful, dangerous work stood in her space and looked at her with eyes that had not once, in all the weeks she had known him, looked anywhere but directly at what was actually there. "Tell me what we're dealing with," she said. "Not what are you dealing with, we." Roman heard the difference. He nodded once, a small nod, almost private, and he began. He talked for 2 hours. Lena sat on the couch with her coat finally off, and her knees pulled up and a glass of water she didn't drink, and Roman sat in the chair across from her, not close, not performing distance, just occupying the chair the way he occupied every space he entered, with the particular stillness of someone who has learned that stillness is its own form of control. And he talked. The men were named Caruso and Velik. Not their real names. Roman didn't give her real names, and she understood by now that the withholding was protection, not evasion. Caruso ran the Eastern Logistics Network that had been, under Eter Vescari, the primary vehicle for moving things that could not be moved through legitimate channels. Velik was the financial architect, the man who had built the layering systems that kept the network's money clean on paper. Both men had spent 14 years believing Roman was their silent partner in the legitimate business, believing the hotels, the real estate holdings, the consulting firm were generating income that eventually cycled back. Roman had maintained that belief through careful performance, attending the right meetings, speaking the right language, never moving so fast toward legitimacy that the distance became visible. 3 weeks ago, Velik's accountant had found a discrepancy. Not in Roman's books. Roman's books were impeccable. In the flow. In the fact that 14 years of supposedly cycling income had never, in any detectable form, arrived. The legitimate businesses were profitable, fully documented, and entirely self-contained. Nothing cycled, nothing returned. The performance had been the whole operation, and the accountant, running a routine audit, had looked at the numbers long enough to understand that the performance was all there had ever been. Velik had called Caruso. Caruso had made calls of his own. And somewhere in those calls, Lena Ashcroft's name had surfaced, because Marcus had been sighted near her building, because the restaurant incident had been noticed by people who noticed things, because Roman Vescari had broken 14 years of operational discipline for a woman he'd met through a wrong number, and the break in discipline was itself a data point. They reached Gavin, Roman said, not directly, through an intermediary who presented it as background information on a mutual acquaintance. Gavin doesn't know who he was talking to. He thinks he found leverage. He doesn't have leverage, Lena said. No, but they used him to send me a message. The call you got tonight, that was Caruso's people. They wanted me to know they could reach you. She held that. What do they want? She said. They want the agreement honored, he said. They want the money they believe they're owed. 14 years of returns on the legitimate operations, which don't exist. And if you tell them that, he looked at her. Right, she said. She uncurled from the couch and stood up, because she needed to move, because the shape of it was becoming clear and the clarity of it required standing. She walked to the window. Outside, the city was doing its 2 a.m. thing, quieter than it ever fully got, the traffic reduced to the occasional headlight, the distant sound of something that might have been a siren 2 neighborhoods over. How long do we have? She said. Days, he said. Maybe less. And Marcus and 3 others. They're good. But Caruso has more. She turned. What does more mean? It means this is not a situation I can protect you from with 4 men and good intentions. He said it without softening it, and she was grateful for that. The absence of softening, the refusal to make the picture smaller than it was. I have been making calls since I left your building tonight. There are people I can contact, federal contacts. People I've been developing for the better part of a decade, specifically for a situation like this one. If I give them Caruso and Velik, give them the full structure of the network. Names, accounts, the operational architecture. They can move fast enough to neutralize the threat before Caruso decides that removing a pressure point is easier than negotiating. She understood what he was saying. She was a law student. She spoke this language. "You'd be giving them your father's entire network," she said. "Yes. And yourself." A pause. "I've spoken to my attorney. There are structures in place. Proactive cooperation at this scale, with this level of documentation. I've been building the documentation for years. My exposure is manageable." She almost laughed at the word. Manageable. His recurring term for things that were going to cost him enormously. "Roman, it's the right call," he said. "It's the call I should have made years ago instead of the 14-year version." "Why didn't you?" He looked at the floor for a moment. "Because it was my father's," he said. "Even the parts I hated. Even the parts that kept me up at 3 in the morning for the better part of a decade. It was what was left of him. And I was—" He stopped. "You were trying to fix it from the inside," she said. "I was trying to fix it from the inside and also trying to hold on to something I should have let go of." He looked up. "That's not an excuse." "I know," she said. "I'm not asking for one." She walked back to the couch and sat across from him and looked at him, at the exhaustion that had settled into the lines around his eyes, the particular tiredness of a man who has been carrying the same weight in different configurations for 14 years and has finally arrived at the place where setting it down is the only remaining option. "Make the calls," she said. He looked at her. "Make the calls, Roman. Tonight. Don't wait until morning." "What?" He mud the calls from her kitchen while she sat in the living room and listened to the shape of them. Not the words. She couldn't hear the words, but the cadence, the pauses, the specific tone of a man delivering information he has organized for years into the hands of people who can use it. He was on the phone for 40 minutes. When he came back, he looked like something had shifted in him. Not lighter, not exactly, but different. Like a building after load-bearing work has been done to the foundation. "They're moving in the morning," he said. "Coordinated. Multiple agencies. By noon tomorrow, Caruso and Velik will be in federal custody. And you. My attorney will be there when I make the formal statement. It'll be a long day." He paused. "Several long days." "I know." "Lena, you should stay somewhere else tonight, not here." She shook her head. "I'm serious. If Caruso moves before the morning—" "Marcus is downstairs," she said. "You told me that 10 minutes after you arrived." He looked at her. "I pay attention," she said. Something moved in his face, that almost smile, the brief asymmetric thing she'd learned to watch for. "You do," he said. "I'm staying here," she said. "Go get some sleep. You have a long day tomorrow." "I'm not leaving you alone." "Marcus is downstairs." "Marcus is one person." "Then stay," she said. "On the couch." She woke at 5:40 to the sound of her phone, Roman's number, but he was in the other room, so it wasn't Roman calling, which meant something had happened. She was up and in the living room in seconds. Roman was already standing, his phone at his ear, his whole body in that particular configuration she'd only seen once before in Carver's, when he'd crossed the restaurant, which was the configuration of a man who has made a calculation and is in the process of executing it. "What?" she said. He held up one finger, not dismissing her, just "one moment," and said into the phone, "How many? Where?" A pause. "Is Marcus mobile?" Another pause, longer. "Get him out of the lobby. Now. We're coming down." He ended the call. "They didn't wait for morning," he said. Her blood went cold. "How many?" she said. "2 vehicles, parked on opposite ends of your block. Caruso sent people to apply pressure before the federal window closed." "How did he know the federal window was closing?" Roman's jaw tightened. "Someone in my attorney's office. A call was monitored. We have a leak." She was already moving, pulling on her shoes, her jacket, reaching for her phone and her keys in the practice sequence of a woman who had spent weeks being ready to move fast. "Where are we going?" "My building. It's secure. If we can get there before they—" Her front door opened, not kicked in, unlocked precisely, with the sound of a key that was not her key, which was worse than a kick, because it meant planning and access and a level of operational sophistication that turned her blood from cold to something past cold. Two men came through the door, not Gavin, not anyone she recognized. Large, professional, the specific quality of men who do this as work, moving through her apartment doorway with the unhurried efficiency of people who have done this in other doorways on other nights. Roman stepped in front of her. The first man said, "We're not here for her. Step away from her, Mr. Viscari." "No," Roman said. One word. Same as in Carver's. Same flat certainty. The second man moved. What happened in the next 40 seconds was something Lena processed in fragments. Roman moving to meet the second man rather than away from him, which she hadn't expected, which she understood later was deliberate, keeping the violence away from her, keeping himself between her and the door. The sound of impact, not movie clean, not choreographed, but the real sound of two large people connecting, which is dull and hard and immediate. Roman was not a small man, but he was one and they were two, and the math of it showed within seconds. She grabbed her phone. She dialed 911 before the first operator syllable, because the time it takes to say "I need help" is time she didn't have. "Two men broke into my apartment," she said to the operator, loud, clear, standing in the corner of her living room with her back to the wall and her eyes on the room. "I need police immediately." She gave the address twice. She kept talking. The first man had turned toward her voice. "Hang up the phone," he said. 37th floor, she said into the phone. "The door is unlocked. Two intruders. One resident, one—" He crossed the room toward her. Marcus came through the door. Marcus was not a small man. Marcus was, in fact, the largest man Lena had encountered in a small space, and he moved through her apartment doorway like a problem being solved. Direct, fast, no excess. And the geometry of the room changed immediately. 3 against 2, the math shifted. The man who had been moving toward Lena pivoted toward the new threat. She kept talking to the operator. It lasted another 90 seconds. She counted, because counting was something to do with her brain, while her body stood against the wall and her hands stayed steady and her voice stayed level. Steady hands, shaking voice was fear, she knew, but what she had was the reverse, which was the anger again, the anger that made her hands flat and her throat tight. When it was over, both men were on the floor, and Marcus had a cut above his eye that was producing a quantity of blood that looked alarming but wasn't slowing him down. And Roman was standing in the center of her living room with his right hand against his ribs, in the specific way of someone who is not touching the injury but is aware of it, and he was looking at her. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No," she said. "Are you?" "I'm fine." "Roman." "I'm fine," he said, and the word "fine" was doing significant work in that sentence, but she let it go. Because the sirens were audible now from the street below, and the operator was still on the phone asking if anyone needed medical attention, and she needed to handle that. The next 4 hours were police. Then federal agents, who arrived 40 minutes after the police and took over with the particular efficiency of a jurisdiction being asserted. Badges, documentation, a woman in a gray suit who introduced herself to Lena with a card, and a specific lack of eye contact that meant she was cataloging the room while they talked. Roman was taken to a separate space, not arrested, she was told, voluntarily cooperating. And she sat in her living room while her apartment was processed, and she answered questions in the flat, precise language of someone who has been trained to give testimony and understands that every word is a document. At 9:14 in the morning, Roman's attorney arrived. Lena recognized the type before the introduction. Mid-50s, the kind of expensive that doesn't announce itself. The carefully calibrated calm of someone who has managed crises for clients who could afford actual crisis management. He spoke to the federal agents for 11 minutes. Then he came to Lena. "My client has indicated that your cooperation and safety are his primary concern," the attorney said. "I've been authorized to ensure you have separate representation if you need it. There is no cost." "I'm a law student," she said. "I know, the offer stands." She looked at him. "Where is he?" "In the building's management office. He is not under arrest. He is giving a full voluntary statement." "How long?" "As long as it takes." The attorney paused. "He asked me to tell you it. He said to tell you that Marcus's eye is fine. Apparently that was important to convey." She laughed, a short, startled sound, and pressed her hand over her mouth because it was not quite laughter and not quite the other thing, just the release of several hours of sustained, precise control. "Tell him I'm glad," she said. "Son." Caruso was arrested at 11:40, Velik at 12:07. She learned this from the federal agent in the gray suit who appeared at her door at 12:15 with the information delivered in the tone of someone who is telling you a thing without telling you all of the thing. She understood enough. The network's leadership was in custody. The federal case would take years. Roman's cooperation would be documented, assessed, measured against his exposure. But the immediate threat had a shape now, a controlled shape, a shape with handcuffs on it in a federal building downtown. She changed her clothes. She made coffee. She sat at her kitchen table and looked at the wall and was very tired in the specific way that comes not from physical exhaustion, but from the sustained effort of remaining yourself under pressure. The effort of not collapsing into fear, not retreating into the easier version of a person who leaves when leaving is available. She had not left. She wasn't going to. At 2:17 in the afternoon, her phone buzzed. Roman. I'm done here. Can I come? She typed, yes. He arrived in 18 minutes. He was in the same dark shirt from the night before, which now had a long day in it, and he was moving with the slight protective hitch in his right side that confirmed what she'd seen in the living room. The ribs, which he had not mentioned and would not mention unless pushed. His face had the look of a man who has spent 6 hours telling the truth in granular detail to people whose job is to disbelieve it until the documentation forces them not to. He stood in her doorway. The building has a leak in the attorney's office, he said. It's been identified. It won't be an issue. I know, she said. Come in. He came in. She closed the door. He stood in her living room, which 4 hours ago had been the site of something that left marks on the floor that the police photographer had documented. And he looked at her with eyes that had the specific quality of a person who has arrived, finally, at the thing they have been moving toward for a very long time and are not yet certain what to do in its presence. I brought this to you, he said, all of it. You didn't plan to. That doesn't matter. Roman, it matters to me, he said, that it came to your door, that you had to stand against your own wall and count seconds, and he stopped. His jaw was tight. That was not something you should have had to. Stop, she said. He stopped. I'm standing here, she said. I'm fine. Marcus's eye is fine. The bad men are in federal custody. You made the call you should have made years ago, and you made it in time, and everything that needed to be protected was protected. She held his eyes. Stop apologizing for a situation you managed. He looked at her for a long time. You counted, he said. The detail had apparently stayed with him. The seconds. You told the police you counted. It gave my brain something to do. Most people would have. I'm not most people, she said. You know that by now. Something shifted in his face. Not the almost smile, something more complete than that. Something that changed the architecture of it in a way she hadn't seen before. Like a room where someone has finally turned on the actual lights. He crossed the room. He stopped 18 inches from her, close enough that she could see the exhaustion in the skin around his eyes, and the dried blood at his collar from where Marcus's injury had been near him, close enough that the specific gravity of his presence, which she had been aware of since a restaurant 4 months ago, was no longer something she was managing from a careful distance. Lena, he said. Yes, she said, before he'd asked anything. Just yes. Because she was done with the careful distance, because she had stood against her own wall for 90 seconds and counted and stayed. And staying deserved the thing she'd been holding at arm's length for months. His hand came up, the left one, not the right with the injured ribs. And his fingers found the side of her jaw with the particular care of a large man who knows his own strength and has decided to use none of it. And Lena Ashcroft, who had texted the wrong number in a restaurant 4 months ago and could not possibly have understood what that single digit's difference would cost and produce and become, leaned into his hand and closed her eyes. He pressed his forehead to hers. They stood like that for a moment. Just that, just forehead to forehead, breathing in the same air in her apartment that still smelled of police and coffee and a night that had produced too much. And she felt the shake go through him, the one he'd been suppressing since he'd arrived. The specific physical release of a person who has been holding something together through will alone and has finally reached somewhere safe enough to stop. I'm not going anywhere, she said quietly. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Outside her window, the city moved through its mid-afternoon business, indifferent as always, deliveries, arguments, coffee cups, a kid on a bicycle taking up too much of the sidewalk. And inside her apartment, two people stood with their foreheads together in the middle of a life that had been, until very recently, moving in entirely separate directions, and the wrong number that had brought them to the same room still sat in her phone's memory like the most improbable piece of evidence she had ever handled. But the case wasn't closed yet, because Roman pulled back, just slightly, not away but enough to look at her, and his eyes had the specific quality she recognized from the first night, from Carver's, from the precise moment he'd looked across a restaurant and made a decision, except this time what he was looking at was not a woman who needed to leave a table. "There's one more thing," he said. She looked at him. "Gavin," he said. "He's been talking to Caruso's people. He gave them information about you, your schedule, your building layout. He got it from the study group, from mutual acquaintances. He's been collecting it for weeks." Her stomach dropped. "That's witness tampering," Roman said. "Potentially. Material cooperation with a federal investigation subjects. My attorney flagged it to the federal agents this morning." He paused. "They want to talk to you about it. Today. This afternoon." She straightened. She picked up her jacket from the chair where she'd dropped it. "Then let's go," she said. Roman looked at her, at the jacket going on, the practical set of her shoulders, the particular quality of Lena Ashcroft deciding something, which had a shape he was learning to recognize, and which produced in him something he did not yet have adequate language for. "You don't have to." "He used me as a blueprint," she said. "He gave them my building layout." She pulled the jacket straight. "I'm going to walk into that federal building, and I'm going to give them everything I have on Gavin Mercer, and I'm going to do it in language so precise that a jury could read it in their sleep." She looked at Roman. "Are you coming?" she said. He reached for his jacket. They walked out of her apartment together into the hallway, and the elevator came, and the lobby doors opened onto a city that had no idea what had moved through it in the last 12 hours. And they walked out into the afternoon light side by side, and the distance between them was different now. Not gone, not collapsed into something careless, but changed, charged. The distance of two people who have chosen each other through something real and have not yet had the quiet to understand what that choice is going to ask of them next. The federal building was 6 blocks away. They walked. And Gavin Mercer, sitting in his apartment across the city with his third new phone and the wreckage of a plan he hadn't understood he was part of, received a call at 3:04 in the afternoon from a federal agent who introduced herself in the flat, professional tone of someone for whom this was a Tuesday, and said, "Mr. Mercer, we'd like to talk to you about your recent communications with several individuals currently in federal custody." The silence on Gavin's end lasted 4 seconds. Then he said, "I want a lawyer." And the agent said, "That is absolutely your right." And in the federal building 6 blocks away, Lena Ashcroft sat down across a table from a woman in a gray suit and folded her hands and said, "Where would you like me to start?" And the woman said, "The beginning." And Lena said, "All right." And she did not look at Roman, who was in the chair against the wall to her left, but she felt him there, steady, present, the specific gravity of him, which she had felt from across a restaurant in the first minute of knowing him, and which she now understood was not going to diminish with proximity. It was going to do the opposite. She started at the beginning. She talked for 2 hours. And when she was done, the woman in the gray suit looked at her notes, and then looked at Lena and said, "You have an excellent memory." "I know," Lena said. Outside the building's narrow windows, the afternoon was giving way to early dark, the city shifting registers, the light going gold and then gray, the particular quality of a day that had contained too much and was finally beginning to end. It was not over. But the shape of what came next was finally, for the first time in 4 months, something she could see clearly enough to walk toward. The federal case took 11 months to build. Lena knew this not in the abstract way you know a statistic, but in the specific, granular way you know something that has reorganized your calendar, your sleep, your relationship to your own front door. 11 months of periodic interviews in gray rooms with agents who asked the same questions in different configurations, testing consistency, measuring the gaps between her answers for anything that might complicate the case they were constructing around Caruso and Velik, and the network that had, for the better part of 2 decades, operated in the spaces where the law's reach went thin. 11 months of continuing law school, finishing her 2nd year, grinding through her 3rd, With case briefs and moot court arguments and a thesis on coercive control in intimate relationships that her advisor called the most thoroughly researched paper she'd supervised in a decade, not knowing, entirely, where some of the research came from. 11 months of Roman. Not simple. She would not describe it as simple, and she would not describe it as easy, and she would not describe it as anything that fit neatly into the language people use when they talk about love as though it is a condition that arrives complete. What it was? A thing they built with the particular care of two people who have both been burned by carelessness and understand in their bones the cost of moving too fast towards something you haven't yet learned to hold. He was in her apartment 4 nights a week, on average. Not every night. They had talked about that specifically, in the direct way they talked about most things. She needed space to be herself without audience. He understood this because he needed the same thing and had spent 14 years in a world that didn't allow for it. He kept a change of clothes in her closet. She had a key to his building, which she used 3 times before she stopped thinking about the fact of having it. He learned how she took her coffee. Strong, no sugar, the cup held with both hands in the morning until it was half gone. And she learned the specific quality of his silence, how to tell the difference between the silence that meant he was thinking, and the silence that meant something was wrong, and the silence that meant he had simply arrived at a point where words felt redundant. He had good silences. That was not something she'd expected, and it was not a small thing. Gavin Mercer's situation resolved itself in the specific way that situations involving men who have overestimated their leverage tend to resolve. The federal agents had, as Lena had understood they would, found his cooperation with Caruso's people to be of significant interest. The communications were documented, texts, 2 recorded calls, a meeting in a coffee shop that one of Caruso's intermediaries had taken the precaution of recording themselves, which they had not anticipated becoming evidence in a federal proceeding. Gavin had believed he was gathering information. He had been, simultaneously, being gathered. His attorney negotiated. Lena was not privy to the terms, she was a witness, not a party, but the outcome was no criminal charges, full cooperation agreement, permanent notation in his employment record, and the end of his position at the financial firm, which had completed its own internal investigation and found the original expense irregularities to be precisely what Roman's people had indicated they were. Small frauds, petty recalibrations of reality in favor of himself, which was, she understood now, the consistent pattern of Gavin Mercer's entire life. She did not feel triumphant. She had expected to, in the way you expect a feeling when you've been moving toward it for a long time. But what arrived when the notification came from her attorney that the matter was resolved was simply quiet. A room where something loud had been, gone silent. She sat with it for a while, and then she called Petra, who said finally, with the particular satisfaction of someone who has been saying you need to deal with this for 11 months, and has been proved correct. And then Lena made dinner and ate it at her kitchen table and felt the specific lightness of a weight you've been carrying so long you'd stop noticing it, suddenly not there. She texted Roman. Gavin's case is resolved. He replied in 4 minutes. Good. Are you all right? Yes, she wrote. I think I actually am. Good, he wrote. Then, after a pause, I'll bring dinner tomorrow. Don't cook. She smiled at her phone in the privacy of her kitchen. You always say that, she typed. You always cook anyway, he wrote. This time I'm saying it earlier. She put the phone down and finished her dinner and looked at the kitchen that was, for the first time in 11 months, simply her kitchen. Not a room with a case file in it. Not a room where she sat rehearsing testimony. Not a room that smelled faintly of fear dressed up as control. Just a kitchen. Hers. The trial of Caruso and Velik began in the spring of the following year. Lena was called as a witness on the 4th day. She had known this was coming, had prepared for it with the methodical thoroughness she applied to anything that would require her to perform under observation. And she walked into the courtroom in a dark blazer and her good shoes and took the oath and sat in the witness box and looked at the attorney for the prosecution and answered every question in the clean, precise language of someone who understands that testimony is architecture, that each word is load-bearing, that the whole structure fails if a single element is imprecise. She was on the stand for 2 hours and 40 minutes. The defense attorney was skilled and tried 3 different approaches to destabilize her, and each time she waited for the question to finish completely before answering, which was the technique her evidence professor had described as the discipline of the pause. And each time her answer was exactly as long as it needed to be, and not one word longer. And by the end, the defense attorney had stopped looking at her with the expression that meant, "I think I can move this," and started looking at her with the expression that meant, "I cannot move this." She stepped down from the stand. She walked past the defense table. Caruso looked at her as she passed. He was in his 60s, heavier than she'd expected from the name, with the specific face of a man who has spent decades being obeyed and is only beginning to understand that the era has closed. He held her gaze for exactly as long as it took her to pass him, and she held his back, and neither of them said anything. And when she reached the gallery door, she pushed through it and stood in the marble corridor of the courthouse and breathed. Roman was in the corridor. He had not been permitted in the courtroom during her testimony. He was a connected party, technically, and he had been standing in the corridor the entire 2 hours and 40 minutes, which she knew because the federal agent who had escorted her to the stand had mentioned it, not as information she'd requested, but as something he'd observed and judged she might want to know. He was standing with his back against the corridor wall, jacket on, hands in his pockets, doing the particular version of waiting that was not impatience but sustained attention. When the door opened, he looked up. She crossed the corridor. She stood in front of him. "How was it?" he said. "Fine," she said. And then she laughed, because the word was his word, his recurring insufficient word for things that had cost him enormously, and using it herself felt like something like the private language that accumulates between two people who have been through enough to build one. He understood the laugh. She could see that he understood it. Something moved in his face. Warm, real, the full version of the thing that had started as an almost smile in a diner on Clement Street and had been accumulating evidence ever since. "Come on," he said. "I'll take you somewhere that isn't a courthouse." She took his arm. They walked out of the federal building into a spring afternoon that smelled like rain that had already passed, and the particular freshness of air after a system has moved through. And the city was doing its unremarkable, relentless business all around them, and Lena Ashcroft felt, not triumphant, she'd been right about that word, it wasn't the right word, but something adjacent to it, something that had earned an exhaustion and relief all folded into the same sensation. She felt like herself. Fully. Without the portion of herself that had been allocated to fear and vigilance and the management of a threat that no longer had teeth, all of it back, the full allocation, available for the actual living of her actual life. That was not a small thing. Well, Caruso was convicted on 9 counts, Velik on 7. The sentencing, which came in the early fall, produced numbers that the federal prosecutor described to the press as significant, and that Roman's attorney described to Roman in private as better than expected. The network, the structure Etra Viscari had built over 30 years, and that Roman had spent 14 years dismantling from the inside and then, finally, 6 months delivering to federal investigators piece by documented piece, was finished. Not neatly, not completely, in the way that nothing human ends completely, but structurally finished. The skeleton broken, the operations dispersed, the money trails documented and frozen and seized. Roman's exposure, as his attorney had promised, was managed. The term was proactive cooperation of extraordinary scope. The agreement was immunity for full disclosure, with conditions attached to the legitimate businesses, audits, monitoring, a 5-year compliance framework that Roman's attorney had negotiated with the precision of someone building a document that would last. Roman signed it on a Tuesday morning in September in his attorney's office, with Lena sitting across the table because he'd asked her to be there, and she had come. She watched him sign his name to 14 years of work and consequences, and the deliberate, costly dismantling of his inheritance, and she thought about the night in his office, the 90 minutes of honest architecture, the city outside the windows, the way he'd said my father built several other things alongside it that were not this. And she thought about the man who had crossed a restaurant toward her because a stranger had texted the wrong number and sounded like she meant it. And she thought, the distance between that night and this morning is not a distance she could have measured then. And she is not the same person who sat at that dinner table with her wrist aching and her mind calculating the distance to the door. Neither of them were the same people. That was the point. That was, she was beginning to understand the whole point of it. She graduated from law school on a Saturday in May. The ceremony was held in an auditorium that was too warm and had chairs that were too close together and went on for 45 minutes longer than the printed program suggested, and Lena sat through all of it in the deliberate stillness she had developed over 3 years of sitting through things that required patience. And when her name was called, she walked across the stage and accepted her diploma from the dean and shook the hand that was extended and walked back to her seat. In the second row of the guest gallery, Roman Vescari was sitting in a folding chair that was approximately 4 inches too small for him, in a suit that was not too small for him at all, watching with an expression that Lena only saw later in the photograph Petra took from 3 rows back, an expression she would study privately more than once, because it was the fullest version of his face she had ever seen captured, the one without any of the management in it, just the thing itself, unguarded, a man watching someone he loves do something that cost her. Petra cried. Petra would deny this later, and Lena would not push it. After the ceremony, they went to dinner. Lena, Roman, Petra, and 2 of Lena's classmates who had been in her study group since the first year and who treated Roman with the specific, careful politeness of people who know someone is significant but are not entirely sure what category of significant. Roman was quieter than usual at dinner, which Petra noted to Lena in the bathroom during a moment when the men were at the table, and Lena said, "He's always quieter in groups." And Petra said, "He's looking at you like you're a fixed point." And Lena said, "I know," and didn't say anything else. And Petra looked at her for a long moment and said, "You're happy," in a tone that was not entirely a question. "Yes," Lena said. "Okay," Petra said, "Good." And she washed her hands and dried them and walked back out to the table, and that was all. The job offer came from a nonprofit legal advocacy organization 3 weeks after graduation, a position on their litigation team focused on protective order enforcement and legal support for people navigating coercive relationship situations. The interview had lasted 90 minutes. The senior attorney who ran the organization had asked her, at the end, what had drawn her to this specific work, and Lena had paused for exactly the length of time it took her to decide how much of the true answer was relevant, and then she'd said, "I understand the architecture of it from both the legal side and the experiential side. I think that's useful." The senior attorney had looked at her for a moment and said, "Yes, I think it is." She took the job. She told Roman over dinner in his apartment, the apartment she now had a key to and used with the ease of something that had been true long enough to feel obvious, and he put down his fork and looked at her with an expression that was not surprise. "That's exactly right," he said. "You're not surprised." "No." "You knew I'd go toward it." "I thought you might." He picked his fork back up. "It suits you." She looked at him across his kitchen table. "Most people would say it's too close to what happened, that I should have professional distance." "Most people," he said, "would be wrong about what distance is for." She ate her dinner. She thought about that for a while, about what distance is for and what proximity is for, and the specific way in which the thing that had happened to her in a restaurant 4 months into a life she'd thought was moving in a predictable direction had rerouted everything, not by destroying what was there, but by revealing that the predictable direction had been, in several important respects, insufficient. She was a better lawyer for what she'd been through. Not because suffering improves people, she had no patience for that particular piece of mythology, but because she now understood, in her body, and not just her mind, what it felt like to sit across a table from someone who had moved your purse to their side without asking, and to calculate the distance to the door, and to be so frightened that you sent an SOS to the wrong number and hoped. She could sit across from a client in that situation and not have to imagine it. That was worth something. That was worth quite a lot. It was Roman who brought up Carver's. Not as a romantic gesture. She had come to understand that romantic gestures of the performed variety were not his register, that what he did instead was specific and quiet and calibrated to the actual person rather than the idea of the moment. He brought it up at breakfast on a Sunday without preamble. "Do you want to go back?" he said. "To Carver's." She looked up from her coffee. "Not to, not for anything symbolic," he said, which was exactly what she would have said if she'd been the one raising it. "I just thought it's a good restaurant. We've never actually eaten there under normal circumstances." She considered it. "Normal is a strong word," she said. "Better circumstances." "Yes," she said. "Let's go." They went on a Thursday evening because Thursday evenings at Carver's were quieter than weekends, and they both preferred quieter. The hostess did not recognize them. The table they were given was not the same table. It was toward the back, better lighting, chairs that were actually comfortable, and they sat down and the menus were placed and they ordered without drama, and the food came, and they ate it. The salmon was on the menu. Lena ordered it. Roman noticed. He did not say anything about it, but she saw him notice. "I actually like salmon," she said. "I know," he said. "I just didn't like being ordered it without being asked." "I know," he said again. She ate her salmon. It was well prepared. The restaurant was good. She could see why he'd suggested returning, the actual quality of the place underneath the memory of what had happened in it. They talked about her first week at the new job, a client meeting, the specific procedural obstacles in a case involving an order that had been violated twice and not acted upon, the particular frustration of a system that made the right thing unnecessarily difficult. Roman listened with the full attention she'd stopped consciously registering because it had become the baseline, the thing she now measured other conversations against. He talked about the compliance audit, the first under the new framework, which had gone, in his word, fine, and she had looked at him and said fine back to him in a specific tone that made him set down his wine and look at her with the warmth she still wasn't entirely accustomed to, the warmth that had been there from the beginning underneath the careful architecture, waiting. "It went well," he said. "Better than fine." "Better than fine," she repeated. "What does that look like?" "It looks like a business that has nothing to hide," he said, which is, I hadn't realized how different that would feel. From the inside. She held that. "Different how?" she said. He was quiet for a moment, turning his wine glass by the stem in the slow way he turned things when he was arriving at a precise answer. "Lighter," he said finally. "I keep waiting for the other call, the one where someone needs something managed. The one where I have to calculate." He shook his head slightly. "It hasn't come." "It won't," she said. "No," he agreed. "It won't." They ate. The restaurant moved around them. The particular orchestrated noise of a good room, the couple to their left laughing at something, the foretop behind them conducting what appeared to be a business dinner with the low-grade tension of a business dinner, a child at the bar table with his parents who was covertly eating his father's dessert and pausing every time the father glanced down. Ordinary life, conducting itself in its ordinary configurations. Lena looked at the room and thought about the last time she'd sat in it. The calculation of the door, the wrist, the wrong number typed blind into a phone. And the distance between that woman and this one was not a distance she could measure in months alone. It was measured in everything that had happened inside the months. The choices made at each branch point, the choice to send the second text, the choice to stay in her apartment, the choice to walk into a 19th floor office on a Sunday evening, the choice, in the chaos of a night that had come through her door, to stand against her own wall and count and stay and not become someone smaller than she was. She had not become someone smaller. That felt important. That felt like the thing worth carrying forward. Roman proposed at Carver's. She had not seen it coming, which was itself a small achievement on his part, given that she was a person who paid close attention. He had not done the full production of it. No arranged moment, no staff involvement, no speech. He had waited until the plates were cleared and the coffee came, and she was in the middle of a sentence about something else entirely, and he had put a ring on the table between them with the same quiet directness he applied to everything. She stopped mid-sentence. She looked at it. It was not extravagant, not a statement, not a performance of wealth. A single stone, well set, the kind of thing chosen by someone who had thought carefully about the specific person it was for, rather than the general idea of the occasion. "We don't have to do anything formal," he said, "if you don't want that. We could just make a decision between us." She looked at him. "You're proposing and simultaneously offering me the option to not have a proposal," she said. "I'm offering you the option to define it however suits you," he said. "I know what I want. I want to know what you want." She picked up the ring. She looked at it in her hand. She thought about the night she'd stood in the federal courthouse corridor after 2 hours and 40 minutes on the stand, and he'd been leaning against the wall and she'd crossed to him and taken his arm. She thought about the Saturday mornings in her kitchen when he made her coffee exactly right without asking because he'd paid attention. She thought about the night he'd come through her door and stood in her living room with the shake going through him that she'd been the only person in the world allowed to see. She put the ring on her finger. "This is what I want," she said. He looked at her hand, then at her face. "Okay," he said. "Not a performance. Just okay." The simplest word, carrying everything. She reached across the table and took his hand. The left one, not the right, with the rib that had healed but still pulled in cold weather, and held it, and he turned his hand over and held hers back, and they sat in Carver's on a Thursday evening, holding hands across the table, like two people who have survived something and come out the other side of it into the ordinary life that turns out, on close examination, to be the only kind worth wanting. The wedding was small. They had agreed on that without discussion. The agreement arrived complete one morning when Roman had mentioned that his building had a rooftop and Lena had said, "That's what I'd want," and Roman had said, "Then that's what we'll do," and that was the entire planning conversation that needed to happen. Petra was there. Marcus was there, with his wife and a 4-year-old who ran in circles and had to be retrieved periodically from the building's rooftop perimeter by her father, who handled this with the same professional efficiency he brought to everything and seemed unbothered. Roman's brother was there, the brother he'd mentioned once and not mentioned again, who turned out to be younger, quieter, working in landscape architecture in another city, who shook Lena's hand when they met and said, "I've wanted to thank you for a while," without specifying what for. And she had looked at him and understood, in the way you understand things when you've been paying attention, for whatever you did to him, for making him come through on the other side of it different. Roman's attorney was there. The senior attorney from Lena's organization was there. 2 of Lena's law school classmates were there, the ones from the study group, who had by this point calibrated their relationship to Roman from carefully polite to genuinely comfortable over the course of 18 months of dinners and one Sunday afternoon where he had, unexpectedly, fixed a persistent problem with the apartment building's security system using knowledge he hadn't explained and hadn't been asked to. The ceremony was not long. Neither of them wanted long. What they wanted was the specific, witnessed moment of the choice, the formal acknowledgement of a thing they had already been living for a year and a half, made public not for the audience but for the record, the way you file a document, not because the truth changes when it's filed, but because filing it makes it findable. When it was over, Petra cried again. This time she didn't try to deny it. She stood at the rooftop's edge with a glass of champagne and cried openly and said, "I told you," to Lena, who said, "You told me what exactly?" And Petra said, "I don't know, something. I was right about something." And Lena laughed and hugged her, and Petra hugged back with the particular grip of someone who has been a witness to something they're glad they didn't miss. Later that evening, when the small group had filtered down and out, and the rooftop was empty of everyone but the two of them, they stood at the edge and looked at the city. It was the same city. It was always the same city, unremarkable in its relentlessness, going about its business in the dark below them, completely indifferent to the fact that anything had been decided on a rooftop above it. That was the thing about cities. They did not pause for human arrangements, no matter how significant. The traffic lights cycled, the deliveries moved, the kid on the bicycle who was always taking up too much of the sidewalk, or some version of that kid, eternal, was somewhere below, taking up too much of the sidewalk. Roman's hand was warm where it held hers. "Do you think about it?" she said. "The restaurant." "Sometimes," he said. "What do you think about when you think about it?" He was quiet for a moment. The thinking silence, she knew it by now as well as she knew any of his silences, which was completely. "I think about the walk across," he said. "I think about... I hadn't decided what I was going to do. I went because you sounded like you meant it, and I walked in and I didn't have a plan. I just walked toward your table." She looked at the city. "I think about the text," she said. "The wrong number. I think about how many times I've done that, typed something wrong, sent it wrong, had to apologize for the mistake. And that was the one time the mistake was the right thing." "Was it a mistake?" he said. She thought about it. She thought about Danny's number, the 6 instead of the 5, the blind-typed message in a restaurant where she'd been frightened and precise about everything except the one digit that had mattered most. "No," she said. "I don't think it was." He made a sound, low, brief, the sound that functioned for him as a laugh when something landed in exactly the right place. "Neither do I," he said. She leaned into his side. He put his arm around her and she felt the slight pull of the healed rib in the way he adjusted, the small, permanent consequence of a night that was now 2 years behind them, the body's record of what had been survived. They stood there. Below them, the city moved. Above them, the specific dark of a city sky. Not black, not quite, but the particular amber gray of a place that generates its own light and drowns out most of the stars. 1 or 2 visible, if you looked. She looked. In her phone, in the storage of a conversation thread she had never deleted, the wrong number sat at the top of a message chain that had started with, "I know you don't know me," and included, somewhere in its 11 months of accumulation, a restraining order, a federal investigation, a graduation photograph, a dinner at Carver's, and 1 ring placed on a table without ceremony by a man who understood, better than most, that the truth doesn't change when you make it formal, but that making it formal matters anyway. She had not deleted it. She didn't think she ever would. Years later, this is the last thing, the thing that closes it. Years later, someone at a dinner party would ask how they met, the way people always ask, the social ritual of origin stories. And Roman would look at her before answering, which he always did, and she would answer first because she always did. "I texted the wrong number," she said. And Roman, who did not usually perform his warmth for rooms, who carried most of what mattered in the specific private language they had built between them over years of coffee and silence and honest architecture, and 2 people becoming, gradually and at some cost, the least frightened versions of themselves. Roman laughed. He laughed the way you laugh when something is the truest possible description of the most improbable possible thing, which is the purest kind of laughter there is. And then he said, to the dinner party, in the quiet, certain voice that had not changed since a restaurant on a night 4 years ago, when he'd crossed a room without a plan toward a woman who sounded like she meant it. She texted exactly the right one. And the dinner party moved on to something else, the way dinner parties do. The conversation turning to other things, other lives, the ordinary accumulation of evenings that make up a life. And across the table, under the table, Lena's hand found his, and he turned his palm up without looking and held on. The end.